This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. My friend and lawyer Nikhil Mehra joins me today once again. We are talking to Nikhil today about Kashmir. There is a lot of talk in India about how some political parties and some groups believe they can bring back Article 370, the very contentious legislation that was supposed to be temporary in the Indian Constitution but dragged on for more than 70 years until it was a few years ago removed from the books by the Narendra Modi government, putting an end to the different status or quasi-independent status of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir now, by Indian law, is a completely integrated region with the rest of India. But some people are trying to, at least through propaganda, suggesting that they will bring back Article 370. Is that even possible? And what implications would that have? All this with Nikhil Mehra. Nikhil, thanks very much.
Thank you so much for having me, Hindol. Always a pleasure.
Tell us, Nikhil, can one bring back Article 370?
One can do a lot of things in life, I think. But when you bring them back, there will be consequences. Look, let's just sort of examine what the Supreme Court said in the judgment, right, in the Article 370 judgment. And really, where it sort of stems from is to say that
2019 August judgment.
No, the judgment is a little later. The provisions are from 2019 August.
Oh, right. Yes. The judgment is a little later. That's right. Yeah.
Right. The essence of it is to say that Article 370 is not a dissimilar provision to what existed for a number of other states. For which reason J&K, in fact, lost all sovereignty in 1949 itself. And certainly with the promulgation of the Indian Constitution on 26th of January 1950. And so there's no question of any residual or any other form of sovereignty vesting in the state of J&K. Right? I say this because, to me, the idea behind this kind of rhetoric of bringing back Article 370 appears to be, the unsaid bit appears to be, we will restore a level of sovereignty that you have always imagined to yourself. Whereas the Supreme Court judgment is you never had this sovereignty, in fact. It doesn't matter that 370 existed. It doesn't matter that, and let's just be clear about the mechanism of 370. 370 subclause 1 was being used to induct portions of the Constitution as being applicable to the state of J&K. And not merely, and otherwise J&K also had its own constitution, but that constitution, it is a highly debatable question whether it was in fact a constituent document in the way in which we recognize constitutions. And the twofold argument there was a constituent document, a constitutional document, must have the power that all sovereigns possess, which is to take or give away land. Right? And it is also completely silent on fundamental rights. It has no fundamental rights chapter. Right? So now that you have the Indian Constitution that goes into J&K, by virtue of all of this that was done under Article 370, now 370 essentially being one clause which says that the Constitution applies in toto, you would effectively be saying we are removing the Indian Constitution, right? And there is a finding recorded by the court in that judgment which says that by the operation of the Indian Constitution, which is a comprehensive document, the Constitution of the J&K becomes inoperative and is rendered redundant. Now, there is a theory of eclipse and of revival. That effectively what other side would try and argue is that the Article 370 judgment and the removal of Article 370 in the way in which it was done, or the amendment of it in the way in which it was done, effectively eclipsed the J&K Constitution. But the moment we reverted back, the J&K Constitution revives. Now, if that revival were to occur, Hindol, let's be clear, you are going from a regime of fundamental rights to a regime without fundamental rights in the same way. Right? Or you'd have to do some kind of mixed regime, which would render the presence of 370 in any event quite a pointless exercise. Really, the court throughout that hearing was saying, why did you even have to do all of this with 370? You could have just used one of the provisions and said the entire Constitution applies, the hell with everything else. And the moment it applies, everything else which is contrary to that Constitution goes away. All this drama wasn't necessary. And under Article 370, subclause 3, the president could have done what he needed to do in any event. And that was the only mode for amending Article 370 at that time. The idea now seems to be that because 370 has become an ordinary article like any other article and no longer contains a self-contained exclusive mechanism for its own amendment, right? It can now be amended exactly as any other provision of the Constitution can under Article 368. Now, I am not aware whether 368 has been amended as well to somehow place 370 in the supermajority provisions. I must confess, I'm not completely aware. Constitutional drafts that I've seen, the latest provisions of the Constitution that I've seen do not suggest that. So for a moment, if you will allow me to share screen, if you'll enable share screening for me.
Sure. I can't see any request to share screen.
At the bottom, there's
multiple. Yes, you can now, I think.
Called share, right? So you've
Yes,
enabled it?
I have.
Okay. I'm going to see how I get to this particular. Sorry, slight.
So what are you trying to share though?
I'll show you what I'm sharing. 1 second, it'll just come up. Sorry, can you see it now?
I can.
The Article 368?
Yes.
Right. So power of Parliament to amend the Constitution and procedure therefore. Right? And so I'm going to read this a little closely because this is imperative now. Notwithstanding anything in this Constitution, Parliament may exercise of its constituent power, a very important element here. This is a power to amend the Constitution. So therefore, it must be a root power, a constituent power. Amend by way of addition, variation, repeal, or repeal any provision of this Constitution in accordance with the procedure laid down in this article. And really, the truth about the Indian amending power is we did make the longest Constitution in the world, but actually our founding fathers kept the amending power extremely loose. There are very few constitutions that can be amended as easily as the Indian Constitution can. Sometimes it almost looks like you're amending a statute. That's how easy it is. And that's why so many amendments have happened over time, right? So an amendment of this Constitution may be initiated only by the introduction of a bill for the purpose in either House of Parliament, and when the bill is passed in each House by a majority of the total membership of that House, which means you have to cross the 50% mark of that House, and by a majority of not less than 2/3 of members of that House present and voting. So this inherently creates a quorum, right? That mathematical calculation creates a quorum. It shall be presented to the President, who shall give his assent to the bill, and thereupon the Constitution shall stand amended, provided that if such amendment seeks to make any change in the following articles, 54, 55, 73, 162, 241, or certain chapters and certain parts, any list, representation of states and parliament, or the provision of this article, the amendment shall also require to be ratified by the legislatures of not less than 1/2 of the states by resolutions to the effect passed by those legislatures. Right. So 370 today, please let's understand that 370 as it stood, I'm going to stop sharing now because we've seen this. And the short point I wanted to make is clear. So 370 as it stood had its own amending power. Now let's say 370 becomes an ordinary article of the Constitution, would be amended under 368 first clause, because it doesn't actually find mention there, but it wouldn't have found mention in the second clause, because the amendment of 370 was not contemplated under 368 at the time that 368 is enacted. So perhaps there's an amendment needed to 368 itself. And that would require that supermajority, right? To put 370 out of reach. So 370, as I understand, I know there's a lot going around on Twitter in particular that, no, this would require a supermajority. I haven't quite seen the basis of why a supermajority may be necessary. Perhaps I'm missing something. Perhaps there's another piece in this puzzle that I am not looking at. But 368 as it stands would not require 372 for it to be amended to require a supermajority. But let's say, therefore, it does not require a supermajority.
Let me just pause you for 1 second, Nikhil, and get the gist out of what you're saying for people who don't understand a lot of legalese, right? You are essentially saying Article 370, the bone of contention, which for the longest time since independence gave the state of Jammu and Kashmir special provisions, including its own sort of local government and including its flag. That's why Shama Prasad Mukherjee famously said that in the same country there cannot be, two flags and two constitutions, right? Ek desh mein do vidhan, or I
Do
forget the
nishan.
Hindi.
Do
दो
nishan.
निशान and दो विधान नहीं रह सकते, right? So therefore, all this entire provision, which created so much confusion, so much calamitous sort of activity in Jammu and Kashmir, once that has been removed, there isn't an easy way to bring it back. And political parties who are saying that, well, we're going to bring it back, cannot do this easily at all.
Yeah, so again, to me, all of this, and I'm going to rely on a Supreme Court judgment on this issue. Supreme Court is essentially saying 370 was always a storm in a teacup. Okay, there are a number. I mean, I've done a very extensive podcasts on 370, but just to be clear, it is not only the JNK, but a number of other princely states who, at the time of that transitional period between independence in 47 and the acceptance of the Indian Constitution's draft on the 26th of November 1949, during this transition period, a number of these princely states had their own constitutions. Just that because those places were all peaceful places, or relatively peaceful places, where you could immediately exert control, the provisions that they had in their constitutions and their local considerations and requirements were actually absorbed by the Indian Constitution in various parts. So there are other states that have special provisions under 370, A, B, C, so on and so forth. But there are also other chapters of the Constitution that were incorporated solely for this and that have now later been removed. And everybody has sort of been inducted to a parity, effectively a parity. There is no hierarchy of states anymore, which used to exist for a longest time. Why did it exist? Because you're a historian, you know this better than I do, in fact. The Brits never really had control of all of India. Right? So there are parts that fell within the rule of the Governor General. But then there are parts that are almost a suzerainty, right? Like they are princely states that have otherwise accepted the sovereignty of the British Crown over India and have certain relations, right? So in terms of revenue sharing, in terms of various other things, in terms of providing men and armies.
I mean, they couldn't keep, in a sense, a powerful standing army. They couldn't do external relations, and of course, they had to accept the suzerainty, as you call it, of the Raj. But within their domain,
they
were
had rule-making power. Yeah. They had rule-making power. Right? This is very important compared to other areas.
Which is why Sardar Patel had to go through this entire process of merging princely India with British India.
That's right. So why do I say the Supreme Court says this is all a storm in a teacup? Because the Supreme Court saying what was done over a 6-month to a year period for every other state took 70 years for you doesn't make a difference. Conceptually, it's the same thing. You were no different to any other princely state. Right? But this rhetoric today is trying to assert a distinction which has been imbued into our psyche over the 70-year period, merely because this provision existed for so long. You talk about the sort of trouble that J&K has seen in terms of various issues arising out of militancy, etc. That is not necessarily 370. That's just the inactivity of Delhi. 370 has what to do with that? I mean, you went from being the Prime Minister of J&K, is what you used to call yourself, to becoming the Raj Pramukh, to becoming a Chief Minister. There is a complete dilution constantly occurring.
I'll tell you what role 370 played in it. Number one, let me put this to you. Number one, it had a narrative power, which is very potent. And I think we shouldn't negate that. In the hearts and minds of people, even though on ground, especially with the presence of the army and so on and so forth, perhaps on ground, there were many things that actually weren't happening, but there was a potent narrative power. Actually, even this claim that we will bring it back is on 70 years of narrative power, right?
All I'm trying to point out is that the underlying logic to the narrative power is rendered senseless by the Supreme Court in its analysis of what 370 was and is. There are other repercussions as well. For example, the domicile laws, the inability to own land in Kashmir, how any Kashmiri who marries an Indian actually marries out. So they were able to create those distinctions by their own lawmaking power. But I would posit to you, and the Supreme Court would posit, that if at any point in time the Indian government had decided to introduce aspects of the Indian Constitution into JNK that were relevant to these particular laws, particularly laws of citizenship, particularly laws of Article 19, Article 19(1), where you have the liberty to reside anywhere in the country, then all of this would have been declared by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional. Although that narrative power has sometimes been so strong that even the Supreme Court's own judgments were awkward. And what this judgment comes and does eventually does say is that a lot of what has flowed prior doesn't actually take into account the history properly, and in fact was wrong. A lot of it was wrong. Right? So, but this is where we stand today. Today, you have a Supreme Court judgment that says all of this was a storm in a teacup, right? So let's say, what would this entail? Like, really, what does it entail? That's why I started with that, right? So you were to reintroduce 370. Let's say you can, and again, I'm giving the caveat that I know that there are people online who are saying that a supermajority is required for amendment. I don't see where that supermajority requirement comes from. But I will assume for a moment that even a simple majority can do it in 368 subclause 1. So be it. Let it be done. So it gets done. What is the effect? The effect is the Indian Constitution, I'm assuming that is the effect you want, is withdrawn. Right? But how? I don't quite see it. Because even if you introduce 370 as it stood, what did 370 as it stands say? That there are only 2 or 3 articles of the Indian Constitution that apply, and for the remainder, you will have to pass a presidential order. Well, a presidential order exists today. So if you were to reenact this 370, you would have to find a way for the president to assent to withdraw that or to annul the existing presidential orders, which means you go back to a state where the entire Indian Constitution does not apply. So now you'd be going to the Supreme Court on a constitutional amendment, trying to defend on basic structure the idea that you can go from a regime in which fundamental rights are guaranteed to a regime in which fundamental rights do not exist and a segregation exists, which reestablishes a sovereignty that in fact the Supreme Court has already declared you never possessed. Right? So you'd be asking the Supreme Court to undo its judgment. Because any amendment to 370, to reinduct 370 as it was, would have to have a basic structure argument. I assume the first argument will be that if I'm going back to a state that existed, then that cannot possibly be contrary to the basic structure. That would perhaps be the argument. But the counter argument would be that the basic structure as an idea evolves, right? And therefore, if it evolves, it has now evolved to a point where the primacy of fundamental rights and its enforcement has taken on a completely different fervor, if I may call it, through the Supreme Court and through the executive all over the country in all kinds of circumstances. For which reason, you would an enactment now or would an amendment now that withdraws fundamental rights be something that is not contrary to the Constitution, contrary to the basic structure of the Constitution? Because, like I said earlier, the doctrine of eclipse and the doctrine of revival effectively would be reviving the JNK Constitution, and that Constitution does not have fundamental rights provision, right? So this is something that you hear quite often in these back and forth debates, that the removal of Article 370 has helped us introduce Article 15 and 16 reservations to JNK, which never existed prior, right? And people have suffered in JNK, particularly in Jammu. In Jammu, you would still have enough of a Hindu population to have the effects of this. And they could never be given the same protections in public employment and in public education in the way in which they receive in other parts of the country. So it would posit a very different kind of question, I think.
I'm glad you mentioned this, because one of the things that many people have pointed out, that if in all this talk about trying to bring back Article 370, we are missing the fact that the removal of Article 370 actually brought many rights for smaller group of minority groups within the state of Jammu and Kashmir, especially in the Kashmir Valley, which they had been denied for more than 70 years.
Not just for minority groups, for everyone. A lot of these rights didn't exist for any. It's like if rights don't exist, they don't exist for anyone. Then what exists is power, right? And so that's
especially bad, for instance, for quote unquote lower caste, just as an example.
Absolutely. So therefore, that would become a very specific example in a basic structure argument, because that would deal with 15 and 16, right? But you need an overarching argument there. And you would have to say, for example, free speech. How can you guarantee the freedom of speech and expression of all people of JNK within their state if their own constitution does not guarantee it? Right? How does the Indian constitution then apply? So perhaps any 370 exercise, reinductive exercise, would have to still do the same process of actually keeping a large part of the Indian constitution applicable to J&K. In which case, it is actually a cosmetic exercise, but a very powerful narrative exercise, as you were saying. Well, my feeling is this, Hindol, there's a lot of this is politics. But I think anybody who tries to reintroduce it again may perhaps be losing the rest of the country.
There's another concern, of course, Nikhil, and that's really the elephant in the room. Article 370 has serious ramifications on India's sovereignty and national security. It always had. And of course, any talk about trying to bring it back really stokes those fires. Many would call these inherently separatist fires. Now, this is very, very problematic, not least because India has such problems on its border with Pakistan, on its border with China, and so on and so forth. Talk to us a little bit about how you see the security angle to such calls to try and bring back Article 370.
Look, so I'll go back again to the storm in a teacup kind of analogy, okay? When broad-based militancy breaks out in 1990 in Kashmir, right? And here's the thing, 89, 90 beginning, when it really erupts, it's actually very sharp, very piquant. For the next few years, it's very piquant because you've just had the end of the Afghan war, and you've got these 87, 88 is when the Russians roll out, and you've got all, like, Pakistan is sitting in all these trained mujahids who are Uzbeks, who are Tajiks, who are from all over those Soviet socialist republics which are Islamic, who are trained warriors, they're jihadis, they're trained fighters. They need another venue of war, and they will only fight a venue of war where Islam is the core principle, the core idea that they are fighting for, right? So you have, for them, geographically, Kashmir was the next battle. They could never have attempted to even enter upon Palestine and fight that battle there. Lebanon was winding down by then. Lebanon's civil war went from 75 to about 90. And by that time, the Christians have pretty much been annihilated. Like, the whole thing was done. So, there was a supreme subversion of majority to minority in Lebanon. So that theater was gone. This came. So constitutionally, what was India's response? Delhi imposed Article 356. You had governors rule for large part of the 90s, in fact, throughout the 90s in J&K. Right? So what is it that constitutionally could not have been done even when 370 existed? Only question was, what was Delhi's appetite to exercise powers? My fear with the reintroduction of 370 is actually a very correct, it's not merely a narrative power, it's a system reintroduction. There used to be a system in place. And that system was milking India and keeping the pot boiling over just enough, such that there would be limited amounts of development, there would be limited amount of any other activity. Terrorism would always be actually one of the tools of the state to keep things as they were. Right? And every time Delhi looked like it's starting to get a little bit heavy-handed, you would have situations like Buranwani, you would have situations like 2003, 2004. You'd stoke up all of these fires all over again. And so really what is being sought to be reintroduced here is things as they existed. And that's, to me, a really difficult political sell, a really difficult security-wise sell. You cannot possibly tell me that terrorism can be tackled in this manner.
Nikhil, I was really shocked a few days ago listening to Omar Abdullah talk about how nothing, in fact, had changed in Kashmir after the removal of Article 370. Now, and I remember talking to you and your mother was in Srinagar. And, I recently went to Kashmir, and everybody who has gone to that place after the removal of Article 370 knows what has changed. I mean, Srinagar market, downtown Srinagar is now alive till midnight. There are, racing cars, competitions
Mr.
happening.
Abdullah,
What is he talking about?
Mr. Abdullah, the next chief minister, so one must have some respect, but it's difficult to muster respect when you say stuff like this. This is absolute horseshit. It's bullshit. You remember in 1990 how difficult, how big a thing it was, and this is in fact a seminal moment in Narendra Modi's own political career, to wave the Tiranga at Lal Chowk. Today, you will see images of the Tiranga everywhere in the Lal Chowk. My parents are, my mother is Kashmiri. My family has suffered the exodus at gunpoint. I mean, she went back and she says it feels like, what it used to prior to all of the problems having started. But they are quite clear that the votes are going to go towards the Congress and towards the PDP. And I don't know how that plays up. Look, let's say let me give you the counterfactual, when you talk about security. Let's say 370 never comes back. Let's say all that rhetoric fails. But a state government comes back, it still brings back the similar system. Right? And what is Delhi going to do? Is Delhi going to then have the gumption to say, I need to impose 356? Right? That's really where we are. So these are piquant problems that relate to, like, look, you have what did the abrogation of 370 allow you to do? Impose president's rule, do it in a harsh way, you justified it on security measures, you took a lot of these leaders. I mean, essentially, they are extremely contrarian to Indian interest, and you put them under house arrest, right? And you're able to maintain peace in that manner. They are champing at the bit to go get back to their old systems. The question is whether the citizenry will allow them to go back to their old systems and how the citizenry will react. So, we have problems that are upcoming with this election. Now, people keep asking, what was the rush? Why did we have to have the election? That is written in the judgment. The Supreme Court decided not to issue any findings on certain other arguments that were raised to the legality of the manner in which the state was bifurcated, etc. On the statement of the Union of India that elections would be conducted in J&K at the earliest, and the cutoff date given by the Supreme Court was the 30th of September 2024. So elections have to happen, right? Failing which, the Supreme Court's lens would turn again here. Now, I sit here and I wonder, if I were in the Modi government, I'd say, all right, yeah, let's face the Supreme Court better than facing another election here when we've started to just put things normal. How do we go back? And why can't you as the central government turn around and say, look, we need more time here because this is a special case. It's a border state. It's had a conflicting history. It's a different kind of history. But constitutionally, you'd be on a very, very weak wicket. So I can understand, because now you say it is like any other state. If it is like any other state, you cannot have a perpetual state of governor's rule then you need to induct a popularly elected government as soon as possible.
Nikhil, I remember going to Kashmir in 2003, I think it was, or something like that, 3 or 4, when I was still, at Jamia Millia Islamia, the Mass Communication Research Center, to make a film. People forget, and I guess younger generations have never really understood or known, Indian phones never worked in Kashmir. An Indian SIM card never worked in Kashmir. It was a real challenge. I mean, making a phone call meant going to some STD booth, and it was almost like calling a different country, calling from Srinagar to Delhi. Right? I mean, and people have forgotten all of this. Jammu and Kashmir, when I was working at Fortune, I realized Jammu and Kashmir was one of India's best performing banks. And lo behold, terrorists had tried to again and again burn it down. All of this seems to have been forgotten. That really shocks and surprises me. But I believe you're telling us that even if it's been forgotten or tried to be erased from public memory, the law remembers.
But look, the problem that happens is this. Once you impose 356, you can only have so many extensions to that proclamation. Right? There's a backstop. I'm not going to go into severe details of all of this, but let's just say there's a backstop. So you can't keep perpetuating this. There is no exception in 356 that says you can keep going on with certain states. Used to be done at one point in time, Indira's time, now can't be done at all. No chance. So if you are first taking the view that I removed 370 to make J&K like any other state, then you can't be contrarian and say, I will not give you the benefit of 356 as it stands. Right? So you have to go through this pain now. Now, of course, what the center may very well do is let them come to power. And if things start heating up, then 356 comes back again and create that cycle again. And perhaps win the people over that way in the idea that while 356 is enforced, your lives are better. Because I have no doubt in my mind these people are going to induct everything back again. Now, let us hope, and you are the international relations expert here, Hindol, that during this period, during which 370 is this sort of governor's rules been in place, that our military capacities and abilities within Kashmir have been ramped up to a degree that where now if trouble were to strike, then we can respond, right? And we deal with it better. That, of course, gets questioned somewhat because of what's been happening in Jammu of late, that the movement of these terrorists into the Jammu region, and we've had so many attacks in Jammu region. But you look at a weakened Pakistan, you look at stronger India, you're hoping that you'll control all of this better now. You don't know. You don't know, because we've already looked at Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is a place where things turn so quickly. We are now looking at a very hostile situation for ourselves on that border as well. So I
You
don't know. I mean,
mentioned
and I really do ask myself this question, that when you have such hostility at the borders, would the Constitution require more flexibility? And it doesn't possess that flexibility today. Let me be clear.
Well, I mean, you mentioned international relations. I find it extremely questionable that foreign diplomats, right before the Jammu and Kashmir election, are merrily trotting off and meeting, local political leaders. I mean, this is very, very questionable. I don't know how this is being justified, but this is very, very tricky.
Is it really though? Because I'm being told that this is quite common for them to do before elections. They meet
I
opposition quite
mean,
often.
do Indian diplomats do this?
That's
Have you ever
that's
read about this?
no, that really is a question of you not exercising your powers. That doesn't mean the other will not exercise their powers.
No, I mean, I'm saying there is also propriety in practice as opposed to propriety in letter, right?
No. So let's be clear then. Then I think what we are all starting to wonder after Bangladesh is China, of course, is a problem, but China is not as interventionist as America can be. To be friends with America, there are rules, and their rules can be very difficult. And perhaps they look at the verdict on the 4th of June 2024 as being that's our way around Modi. Right? Before this, we couldn't find a way around Modi that easily. Now we have a way around Modi. And the rhetoric that we've been getting from the opposition perhaps plays into what they want. Because when I look at Jitni Abadi Utna Haq, and I look at a lot of this call for equity in this sense, in the sense in which it must permeate every field. Because Rahul Gandhi now talks about this is India not being Dalit enough. Now he talks,
Including beauty
that's
contests.
what I'm saying, right? So now what is a resource to which this idea of Jitni Abadi Utna Haq must be applied is actually so broad now that it encompasses every single aspect of your life, right? And to me, that is a straight lift to the concept of equity in the way in which the Democratic Party in the United States is starting to develop it. But of course, the US has a system that's much more robust when it comes to protecting rights. So I don't know how this goes forward.
No, and the US also has a far more robust system and a more common consensus as far as sovereignty and national security is concerned.
They also
I
have a
think one of
greater
the
they
big
also have a
problem in
greater
India is that
consensus.
the consensus about national security and sovereignty has never fully developed.
They also have a greater consensus in the enforcement of their liberties and rights within the country, right? So they are not going to so readily accept a challenge to private property. Even the courts will not do it in the way in which this kind of action will require. Even an equitable action there would require. I mean, I'm not kidding with you. I saw a viral video from the Democratic Convention of a man talking about how the amount of food available in markets will reduce, or the range will reduce, and that will create rationing. And rationing is the definition of equity. And he was eulogizing that as being a positive. Right. So that's the kind of mental capture we're talking about. But okay, perhaps we're digressing a little bit. What I'm trying to drive here is okay, those things are tricky. You still have a central government, you still have certain constitutional mechanisms you can exercise. But how you choose to exercise them, when you choose to exercise them, that's going to be the tricky bit. Look, just get ready for this. 370, they're going to win that combined combination of NC, Congress, and PDP. They will win. And then they will turn around and say, this is actually a denouncement of what you did qua 370. Right? And the answer here will be, I'm sorry, but 370 was not merely the wishes of the Kashmiri people, it had to be the wishes of the Indian people.
Absolutely. Very well put, Nikhil. And I don't think we should forget that. I think we must look at Kashmir far more holistically, and we must, really understand that the will of the Indian people in totality really has as much to do with Kashmir as it has to do with any other Indian state. And I think this is not something we can forget easily. But thank you, Nikhil Mehra, once again for sparing time to talk to us about very sort of protracted issues in Kashmir. Big election coming up. Let's see what happens, and of course we'll be discussing all that once those election results come in. What will happen to Article 370? All eyes on that. Thanks,
No,
Nikhil, once again.
but just to be clear, the state
Sure.
election doesn't affect 370.
Yeah.
You'd have to gain power at the center to affect 370 because you'd be amending the Indian
No,
constitution.
I meant if they win, like you say, the
The
drum
rhetoric,
beats
no, no,
will
so
begin.
I
This
agree
will
with you. I think the
constantly.
system comes back. The system
Yeah.
comes back whole hog. But you would still have an era of no 370 as it existed. So really,
Yeah.
it'll come down to how much gumption center has. What is it willing to put up with, and what is it not willing to put up with?
Here's hoping the center has enough gumption.
They've not been
Thank you.
showing that of late.
We're in interesting times, my friend. We're in very interesting times. We'll wait to see what rolls out in Kashmir in days and weeks to come. Nikhil Mehra, as I was saying, thank you very much for your time. We leave it at that for today.
You're very welcome, Hindol. Thank you for having me.